Chapter 3. Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. Sayadaw didn't know anyone in Rangoon when he arrived in early summer of 1967. Fortunately, the same monk who'd suggested the comparatively pleasant climate of the city as an alternative to the oppressive heat of Mandalay had also suggested a place for Sayadaw to live. The monk from Mandalay had once stayed a few nights at a temple called Kyun Gale Kyang, which was part of the Lanmadal Tiat Ta Kyang Taik monastery complex. The name of the temple means small island. The monk gave me the address, and since we didn't have telephones in those days, I just showed up a ND asked to stay there. They welcomed me. Although Kyun Gale Kyang was a temple comprised of monks from Burma's Karen ethnic group, Sayadaw was able to communicate with the residents of his new community because they shared fluency in the Burmese language. Higher ordination summertime in Rangoon saw a lot of temporary ordinations, as it was part of Burmese tradition. After students have final examinations in April, just after the Buddhist New Year, and begin their summer vacation, which usually lasts about 3 months until school starts again in July, they usually become novices or monks every year. Every temple does this, and some might have 1,000 temporary novices or monks each summer. Even university students become monks every year and practice meditation during the summer. It's good. Toward the end of April 1967, just a week or so after Sayadaw had arrived in Rangoon, the abbot of Kyun Gale Kyong approached him with a question. 42 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988, he said to me, "Do you want to be a monk? You're over 20 now, so you can be one. We have ordinations coming up. I just recently had my 20th birthday. It's up to you, Sayadaw," I said. All I really cared about was having an opportunity to learn. If I had that, I was happy. Higher ordination didn't really matter to me. The abbot, whom we called Kyun Gale Sayadaw, thought I should ordain. He asked me if I wanted to invite my parents and my teacher from my hometown, Umuninda. "No, it's not necessary," I said. "I don't want to bother them." My mother had already died, but I didn't want to trouble the rest of my family to come. Sayadaw's ordination required sponsorship, something typically provided by an ordainee's family. Hearing this, one of the temple supporters, a very rich person, spoke up and said he would sponsor my ordination. But then, just a few days before the ordination, the sponsor changed his mind. I didn't know why at the time, though I would find out later. "It's okay," I said. I didn't mind. Again, I was happy just having an opportunity to learn. But there was an elderly gentleman living at the temple who overheard what happened with Sayadaw's sponsor. Usan Mia was about 80 years old. He was very poor and lived at the temple because he had nowhere else to live. He helped to take care of things around the temple, and he cooked for the monks. He said to me, "You poor young man, your sponsor canceled on you. I have some money. I've saved 260 kyat from donors who came to observe the 8 precepts. They give me a kyat here, a kyat there. Maybe I can buy some robes for you." 43 Las Vegas Sayadaw. He added, "I don't have enough money to support you forever, just this one time." Sayadaw was touched by the generosity of the old layman, was something he would remember and appreciate for the rest of his life. "Okay," I said, "no problem. I appreciate it." And then Kyun Gale Sayadaw said to me, "Okay, he wants to sponsor you. No worries. If you need more robes, I can get you some." Thanks to the generosity of Usamiya and the pledged support of Kyun Gale Sayadaw, Sayadaw became a fully ordained bhikkhu of the Sudama order on May 1, 1967. He was ordained along with 40 or 50 other young men at Thiat Ta Teek Thiandagi, another temple within Rangoon's large Thiat Ta monastery complex. A senior monk named Sayadaw U Kavenda was his preceptor. Sayadaw would later learn that his original sponsor had backed out for 2 reasons. 1. Sayadaw hadn't yet passed any of his higher education examinations, and 2. He didn't feel Sayadaw was handsome enough. Given that a sponsor would have normally invited many guests to an ordination of a young monk, The donor apparently felt that Sayadaw wouldn't look good enough or have enough educational credentials to impress his guests. Decades later, Sayadaw would share with a student that he eventually became Usunmiya's teacher. And when he did, as Sayadaw would receive monetary donations from his own supporters, he would give the money to his generous sponsor. He'd wanted to return the kindness that the elderly temple attendant had shown to him. Usunmiya would spend the rest of his life living with Sayadaw at Kyungale Kyung, 44 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. A change of name. A student once asked Sayadaw why he is sometimes referred to as Uzaya Thuta. When I became a novice, I was given the religious name Zaya. But later, just a few weeks after I went to live in Rangoon from Mandalay, I went to have my eyes checked. The place where they were offering free checkups opened at 8 a.m. Although I got there an hour early, I saw 100 people already waiting. We were told to write our name and address on a piece of paper and then to put it in the appropriate box, one for monks and one for lay people. Then, we were to wait for our name to be called. Sayadaw wrote down his name, then put the paper in the box for the monks. As I waited for my name to be called, I noticed that a lot of people were going ahead of me. 9, 10, then 11 o'clock came. It was lunchtime, so I went off to have some noodles. I returned about noon and asked why I hadn't been called. I told them I'd been waiting since 7 a.m. They went and checked the monk box, but came back and told me that all the papers had already been processed. Mine wasn't in there. Sayadaw asked them to check again, but they still couldn't find it. A nurse spoke up and said, Uzaya could be a monk's name or a layperson's name. Zaya was actually a common name for a layperson, and even a layperson could be called Uzaya. There was even a famous actor in Burma at the time called Uzaya. 45 Las Vegas Sayadaw. Sure enough, it turned out that the person processing the papers had thought that a layperson named Uzaya had accidentally put their slip in the monk box, so they'd skipped him. After I returned to my temple, I asked my preceptor if I could have a different name, something a layperson wouldn't be called. After all, the people at the eye clinic had been confused by my common name, so Sayadaw Ukavenda changed my name to Zayathuta. Zaya means victory or success. Thuta, which is the Burmese pronunciation of Sutta, means knowledge. So Zayathuta basically means success knowledge. 20-year-old Sayadaw began his first year of secondary school in July 1967, with plenty of special challenges. In Burma, boys usually become novices around 10 years old. They start memorizing everything then. And when they study, they kneel on their knees on the floor, several rows of students. The teacher would come around and quiz everyone, one by one, on whichever of the 5 subjects they were working on. There were the 8 chapters of Pali grammar, for example, and the teacher would come around and they'd have to answer his questions. If the student couldn't answer the questions, he had to stand up until it was his turn again, then kneel back down and try again. Sayadaw had gotten a much later start on his monastic education than most of the other students. I didn't even become a novice until I was 18 years old, so the other students in my classes at school had an 8-year head start on me. They had learned for many years already. I was bigger than them and older than them, but I was still a beginner. So I made a determination. After lunch, the monastery 46 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988, is really quiet, and the other students take a 1-hour nap. Instead, I will stay awake and study. I even posted a note for myself and put it in my room. Unless sick, no naps. It was my rule. So while the others slept every day, I studied. To this day, Sayadaw still doesn't take naps. I studied hard. I'd wake at 4 a.m. and start studying. I'd go to sleep at midnight. I just studied and never went anywhere. If I needed soap or anything else, I'd ask a friend to get some for me. I focused on nothing but studying. There was no time for formal monastic training. as the young students were kept fully engaged in their scholastic endeavors. With some 40 students per class, between class periods the students would scurry to their next class elsewhere in the sprawling monastery complex. Thayat Ta Monastery Complex, Lanmada Thayat Ta Kyung Taik, is situated in central Yangon, immediately north of Chinatown. What became the Thayat Ta Mango Grove Monastery Complex was originally established on a mango grove during the pre-colonial period, probably between 1752 and 1846. During the colonial period, the city was demolished and redesigned, leaving many monasteries around the city evicted. In the late 1800s, though, Thayat Ta became the designated site for all of those displaced monasteries, and the complex was born. During the time Sayadaw was living at Lanmada Thayat Ta Kyung Taik, some 700 monks lived on site, though they were spread out over the 64 separate temples within the monastery complex. As an aside, while that's a considerable number of monks living in a monastery, one of Sayadaw's monks at Chaya Meditation Monastery, Ashin Uttara, once lived in a monastery with 1,400 monks. It was one of the relatively few temples in Myanmar that had anagarikas. 47 Las Vegas Sayadaw and Anagarika is a white-robed, 8-precept lay postulate who lives in a Buddhist monastery. Anagarikas have renounced most of their worldly possessions in order to dedicate their lives to full-time practice of the Dhamma. The Anagarikas at Ashin Uttara's monastery took care of the handling of money and other donations for the large body of monks living there. Although relatively rare in Myanmar, Anagarikas are not uncommon in Thai monastic settings. Sayadaw finished his first year of secondary school in April 1968. The challenging first level of study traditionally consists of 5 subjects. 1. 3 chapters of Abhidhamma. 2. Studying and memorizing the 227 rules of the Patimokkha in Pali and Burmese. 3. Anguttara Nikaya, the 4th of the 5 collections in the Sutta Pitaka. It consists of several thousand discourses attributed to the Buddha and his chief disciples. 4. Speaking and writing Pali, including 8 chapters that were dedicated. Fortunately, because of the quality of the Abhidhamma instruction he'd received from Sayadaw U Isarya in Mandalay, Sayadaw had not been required to take Abhidhamma classes that first year. He had, however, been required to take the examinations. Monastic examinations in Burma began in 1648. They are held annually in Mandalay, Yangon, and the southeastern Burmese port city of Moulmein. The examination system is divided into 6 grades based on their level of difficulty. Examination content is based upon all 3 baskets of the Pali Canon, or Tipitaka, which literally means 3 baskets. 1. Vinaya Pitaka, which deals with the monastic discipline. 2. Sutta Pitaka, which contains the teachings in narrative and verse. And 48 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. 3. Abhidhamma Pitaka, which could be characterized as a systematization of the teachings. It is this threefold corpus upon which Theravada Buddhism is based. Students are required to recite from memory specific passages, analyze the content, and to have correct understanding of Pali grammar. Upon successfully passing an examination, the student is eligible to take the next highest level examination. I passed the final examination, which had been set by the government. It was the happiest day of my life. And the next day they wrote about it in the newspaper. I remember going somewhere to look at the newspaper, and there was my name. I was very happy. Sayadaw reflected on having his photo taken in order to take the exam. I'd never liked the idea of having my picture taken, but I'd gotten it taken at the beginning of the school year in order to have an identification photo when I took my exams. That was the first time I'd ever had my picture taken. My sister Win-Win came to visit me after I passed my exams, and I got my picture taken again at summer retreats. With the school year complete, a big ceremony was planned to hand out certificates to everyone who passed their examinations. It was at a place called Mahasi Sasana Yektha Meditation Center. I had received a letter with the date and the time I needed to come for my certificate. The ceremony started at 1 p.m. but I was so excited that I could hardly eat. I ate a bit at 10 a.m. and then went early to the meditation center. When I got there, I saw lots of people sitting in meditation, 300 monks and 400 other meditators. I'd never seen a meditation center before. 49 Las Vegas Sayadaw. I thought, oh, this is what I want to do. Sayadaw enthusiastically made his way to the office to find out how he could participate. And so starting in that very April of 1968, Sayadaw began spending his summer breaks from school at meditation centers. Let's say I finished my final examination today. Tomorrow I'd head off for a silent retreat at a meditation center. I never said a single unauthorized word while I was there either. I did that for around 3 months each summer for 8 years. It was good for me. During those summers, intensive meditation became a driving force in Sayadaw's life. I never had a chance to go back to visit my hometown. I didn't want to travel anyway. Most of the other monks would head off with friends, visit their hometowns, travel, or go on pilgrimage during their time off from school. But I didn't want to do that. I just went to the meditation center, practiced meditation for the summer, then returned to my temple before school started again, before Vasa. It was very good for me. Sayadaw had the great fortune to spend those summers under the tutelage of prominent and highly venerated Sayadaws from Rangoon, Mandalay, and elsewhere. His first 3 summers were spent at Mahasi Sasana Yedkatha Meditation Center, where he'd received his certificate. While Mahasi Sayadaw was the founder and leader of the tradition practiced at the center, in which he'd become the spiritual director in November 1949, much of the meditation instruction was offered by 3 of his senior students, Sayadaw U Sujata, Sayadaw U Pandita, and the latter's junior Sayadaw U Janaka. Sayadaw U Janaka had begun training under Mahasi Sayadaw during 1953-1954, but had only recently, in 1967, been appointed by the 50 Rangoon, 1967-1988, master as a meditation teacher at Mahasi Sasana Yedkatha Meditation Center. He'd hold the position until 1972, and eventually come to be called Chanmyai Sayadaw. Las Vegas Sayadaw spent that first summer retreat training directly under Sayadaw U Pandita, while the second and third summers were under Sayadaw U Pandita's senior and Mahasi Sayadaw's first chief disciple, Sayadaw U Sujata. In July 1955, Mahasi Sayadaw had sent Sayadaw U Sujata to Sri Lanka, after the island country's government formally requested instruction on Satipatthana meditation. Mahasi Sayadaw himself was unable to attend as he was engaged with the 6th Buddhist Council in Burma. The year that Sayadaw U Sujata subsequently spent in Sri Lanka was a huge success, prompting the Sri Lankan government to build a Vipassana meditation center in the Mahasi tradition. Decades later, Las Vegas Sayadaw would briefly reflect on his 2 summers training under Sayadaw U Sujata. He had great metta. He was very nice. Although Sayadaw U Sujata was Mahasi Sayadaw's first chief disciple, it was his second chief disciple, Sayadaw U Pandita, who would become the great master's successor after his death in 1982. Sayadaw U Pandita was very strict. There were a lot of monks in those days, and we practiced and practiced, so he didn't have an opportunity to give us detailed teachings. Mainly, we just reported our meditation experiences to him, and he'd correct us. There would be many monks sitting ready to report to him. He'd spend 5 minutes with each one, then it would be the next monk's turn to report his experiences. We did this every day. He didn't give Dhamma talks. We just interviewed with him, then he'd correct and encourage us. Mahasi Sayadaw was already a legend by the time Las Vegas Sayadaw first arrived at his center in April 1968. He taught a controversial but highly effective method of focusing one's attention on the rising and falling of the abdomen as the primary object of meditation. 51 Las Vegas Sayadaw Mahasi Sayadaw had gained widespread international renown for his role in the 6th Buddhist Council, an assembly of 2,500 monks from Burma, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, India, Nepal, and Pakistan that convened in Rangoon from the full moon day of May 17, 1954, to the full moon day of May 24, 1956, the 2,500th anniversary of the Buddha's death. During the council, the Pali Canon was recited in its entirety by the assembly. As in the preceding 5 councils, The purpose of this council was to affirm and preserve the genuine Dhamma and Vinaya. It was Mahasi Sayadaw who'd been appointed to ask the appropriate questions about the Dhamma and Vinaya to Mingun Sayadaw, who'd been appointed to answer them as the chief respondent. Mingun Sayadaw was a noteworthy monk in his own right. The Burmese monk was famous for his extraordinary memory. In May 1954, he'd recited from memory without error 16,000 pages from the Pali Canon. During the council, he was reportedly able to recall the exact book, page, and line of every term in the canon. In time, Mahasi Sayadaw would have a significant impact on the teaching of Vipassana meditation, not just throughout Asia but in the Western world as well. On every Buddhist holy day, Mahasi Sayadaw himself would give a 2-hour Dhamma talk in the main hall, and we'd go to hear him. All the monks would go, and the talk was always about meditation practice. We wouldn't interview with Mahasi Sayadaw, just listen to his Dhamma talks every week. It has been suggested by some that Mahasi Sayadaw had attained the stage of Anagami by the time he died, some 14 years after Las Vegas Sayadaw first encountered him. But many more followers believe that he was an arahant. One of Las Vegas Sayadaw's lay students would one day ask him what he thought about this. I personally believe he was an arahant. I saw him almost every day. I watched his behavior, listened to the way he spoke. I have very high respect for him. 52 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. Sayadaw spent his 4th summer at a Moulmein meditation center in the Sunlun Sayadaw tradition, which offered a different meditation technique than what he'd learned at Mahasi Sasana Yektha Meditation Center in Rangoon. Sunlun Sayadaw, who lived from 1878 to 1952, was the founder of a Vipassana meditation tradition that emphasizes vigorous breathing, focusing on Vedana, particularly pain, and not moving for 2 or 3 hours at a time. Sayadaw recalled the method he was taught at the center. Their way of practice is to focus on the breath. They breathe quickly and shallowly for 30 minutes, then try to focus on sensation. Sunlun Sayadaw was widely believed to have gained the 4th and final stage of enlightenment. He was very famous. Everyone believed he was an arahant. He couldn't even write his name, and before he was a monk he had to work in an office where he earned only 8 kyat. He used his thumb to sign his name. But then one day he became a monk and continued to practice meditation. He eventually gained full enlightenment. After that, he knew everything. He could answer any question. One day Prime Minister U Nu went to pay respects to Sunlun Sayadaw. The Prime Minister was an educated man. He was a writer and a preacher too. He asked Sunlun Sayadaw about some high-level Dhamma, which the master could explain even in Pali. This was amazing because he couldn't even read or write. When he died, they didn't cremate his body. They just put it under the pagoda at his temple. Sayadaw's 5th summer, 1972, was spent in meditation at a center in the Te-in Gu Sayadaw tradition. It was just a year before the great master died at the age of 60. Te-in Gu Sayadaw had led a particularly interesting life. He had ordained later in life after having been married 3 times and at 153 Las Vegas Sayadaw Point being injured while he was burglarizing a home. He later attained arahant only 21 months after becoming serious in his practice of meditation. The Te-in Gu method was characterized by sitting in meditation without moving for extended periods of time, starting with no less than 2 hours. Te-in Gu Sayadaw was still alive when I was there. I used to see him when he'd offer us Dhamma talks. And when we practiced meditation, his secretary would walk around and coach us. They taught us to put our entire focus on hard, fast breathing. We'd have to sit there without moving for 2 hours while we did this. The 6th summer was spent practicing in the Mogok Sayadaw tradition. The Mogok method emphasized specifically focusing one's attention on the mind. I practiced for 3 months at the Mogok Sayadaw Center in Rangoon. They specifically used focusing one's attention on citta during meditation. They taught from a chart that depicted the law of dependent origination, and they'd explain the Dhamma and Vipassana meditation using that chart. The methods offered by those two arahants during his 5th and 6th summer retreats helped Sayadaw broaden his experience with different vipassana meditation techniques to an even greater degree. For the 7th summer, Sayadaw practiced at a Rangoon center in the tradition of Mingun Jetawun Sayadaw. Mingun Jetawun Sayadaw, not to be confused with Mingun Sayadaw, was the teacher who introduced Mahasi Sayadaw to vipassana meditation in the 1930s. Unlike the method later developed by Mahasi Sayadaw, though, Mingun Jetawun Sayadaw taught using breathing in and breathing out as one's primary object of meditation. He was Mahasi Sayadaw's teacher. Instead of teaching rising and falling, his tradition teaches mindfulness of breathing in and breathing out. Otherwise, the teachings are the same, only the primary object is different. 54 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. The two masters are of the same lineage, but there were just a few hundred meditators at this center, whereas there were over 1,000 meditators when I was at the Mahasi Center. Mingun Jetawun Sayadaw, who was also known as U Narada, lived from 1868 to 1955. Near the beginning of the 20th century, he'd eagerly begun to search for the way to enlightenment. He eventually met an enlightened monk in the Sagaing Hills near Mandalay. The monk had reminded him that the Buddha had taught that enlightenment was found only through practicing within the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And so Mingun Jetawun Sayadaw began his effort in earnest. In just 3 years' time, he attained enlightenment at the age of 40. Mingun Jetawun Sayadaw would become a key figure in the revival of vipassana meditation, teaching his controversial method of noting phenomena of mind and matter as they arise. During an 8th summer, Sayadaw joined his Abhidhamma teacher from Mandalay, Sayadaw U Isarya, for a retreat in the jungles of central Burma. They traveled together to a deep forest called Phayat Kwe Tara, Pien Manar, where Sayadaw slept in a tent and his teacher took up residence in a small structure nearby. The two monks would leave the forest to go on alms round in a nearby village each morning, but otherwise spent their time in deep meditation in the forest. It was just me and my teacher. We had a small building we could use, but in that place they had a lot of big trees. It was the jungle, and the trees had tree guardians that weren't nice living in them. When we first started staying there, some of the local villagers told my teacher, "You have to be careful. This isn't a normal forest. A lot of angels and evil beings live there." One day my teacher allowed someone to cut down a small tree. When they did, the tree fell and landed on my teacher. He was taken to a hospital, and although he was eventually discharged, about 10 years later he died from complications related to that incident. 55 Las Vegas Sayadaw. It was very peculiar the way it happened. Those tree deities killed my teacher. I know this. After the incident with Sayadaw U Isarya, the villagers repeated their warnings to Las Vegas Sayadaw. The locals reminded me about the tree deities living in the forest. So I had to practice loving kindness a lot. And I did some protection chanting too. I had to be careful. Even after he returned to student life as school resumed near the end of July each year, Sayadaw made a point to set aside the weekly Buddhist holy days for day-long practice of the meditation techniques he'd learned during his retreats. Practicing in a variety of centers, environments, and traditions during those 8 summers had given him a useful perspective on some of the different methods of vipassana meditation, though he found himself being particularly drawn to the Mahasi Sayadaw method. I think the Mahasi method is the best. I've studied scripture a lot and practiced a lot of meditation too. When I compare scripture to practice, I like the Mahasi tradition because it's about always being mindful. From the time you wake up, start practicing. Be mindful with every step you take. Other traditions don't necessarily teach that. Some have you sit in meditation while they give you a Dhamma talk. When you're finished, you just go off and start socializing or doing whatever suits you. In the Mahasi tradition, there's no talking. Just practice. Every step, be mindful. Fortunately, I learned early. So ever since I started practicing in the Mahasi tradition, I've tried my best to be mindful of every step I take." At some point during those 8 summers, Sayadaw had what would later be characterized in a short written biography of him in the English language as, quote, "the deepest spiritual experience of his life." 56 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. Had the master attained one of the 4 stages of enlightenment? Decades later, a student approached Sayadaw about that cryptically worded phrase. "Can you tell me what that means?" the student asked. The master simply responded, "That's just how the translator worded what I'd written in Thai about that period of my life." Whether he'd penetrated the Dhamma to some degree during those 8 summers, Sayadaw won't say. Undoubtedly, a student had been putting forth much effort in his meditation. He'd tried hard to closely follow Sayadaw's instructions and guidance. But as he'd not yet experienced any profound realizations or deep states of concentration, he was plagued by doubt as to whether he was practicing correctly. The student brought the concern to Sayadaw. The master replied simply, "If you have mindfulness of the present moment, then you are practicing correctly." Asterisk. Asterisk. A student had noticed that although he'd learned a great deal from reading books about the Dhamma, his growing intellectual understanding of the teachings had actually given rise to doubt. He'd since found himself constantly comparing and contrasting methods, analyzing and rationalizing different aspects of the teachings, and often comparing his own experiences and practice to what he'd read about in all the Dhamma books. The confusion, hesitancy, and uncertainty that had surfaced in the student's mind had created a roadblock in his practice. The student went to the monastery to speak to Sayadaw about this. The master's reply was practical and memorable. "Acquiring knowledge is good. It must be balanced with practice and effort, though. Don't read too much. Instead, practice too much." 57 Las Vegas Sayadaw. A vegetarian Sayadaw had needed time to adjust to the rich support of the monkhood by the Burmese laity of Rangoon. The people would invite us to their homes for house blessings or birthdays almost every day. They would offer us envelopes of money, dana, which is a good practice. They take good care of the monks in Burma. There was no air conditioning, for instance, but they'd put fans next to us to keep us cool. One time I was invited to a house, and they mostly had chicken, pork, egg, and fish for us to eat. A lot of good things to offer to the monks. But I was a vegetarian. I'd been one since I was a teenager. The people would always ask me, "What do you need?" "I don't need anything," I'd say. I didn't want to tell them I was a vegetarian. But they found out later on. Then they all rushed to prepare vegetarian food for me. I felt bad about it. After that happened, I told Kyun Gule Sayadaw, "If they need a monk, I will go, but I don't want to go if there are enough monks to go." It was easy enough for me to get by with what was available. I could just have rice with sugar, or maybe salt and oil. Or maybe I could eat some biscuits, or a little bit of beans. I'd been frugal with my eating since I was young, so I didn't care about food. An exemplary student. In the meantime, Sayadaw continued to work hard in his studies. 58 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. In April 1973, he completed the 6th level of studies, effectively graduating from high school, and prepared to enter the monastic university in July after he returned from his annual meditation retreat. That summer, Sayadaw left Kyun Gule Kyung, where he'd been for 6 years, and moved to another temple within the Lanmada Thayata Kyung Tai complex called Thatanodaya Parayati in preparation for the upcoming school year. The 26-year-old monk started monastic university near the end of July 1973. In those days, there wasn't a central monastic university campus in Burma. Although the annual examinations and ceremonies were generally held in Rangoon or Mandalay, the university classrooms were at individual temples scattered across the country where the monks were actually living. Some of the teachers would erect small signs on the exteriors of their classrooms saying, "Sangha University." Given his drive to learn since he was a youth in Kunhat, it's not surprising that Sayadaw thrived at university, where he was eventually honored as an outstanding student. In 1976, a year before he would graduate, Sayadaw started to teach the other monks when both of his university teachers left for India to pursue their doctoral degrees. They'd asked Sayadaw to teach the monks in their absence, and because of the great admiration he had for his teachers, he'd agreed. I eventually finished my higher education because of all the hard work and support of both of my teachers. I learned a lot from them and felt a sense of closeness to both of them. So when they went to India, I took care of all their classes. One of my teachers left Burma to pursue his PhD, which he eventually completed at Nalanda University in Bodh Gaya. My other teacher went to New Delhi, where he too eventually completed his PhD. Sayadaw now found himself serving as a resident teacher and lecturer to the resident monks at the Thanodaya Pariyatti. It would be a position he'd formally hold for the next 14 years. Unfortunately, the new arrangement meant that Sayadaw would no longer be able to undertake his summer meditation retreats, as he'd need to prepare for the coming school year, both as a teacher and, for now, as a student. 59 Las Vegas Sayadaw. In addition, the abbot of Thathanaudaya Pariyatti, Sayadaw U Pandisa, soon assigned Sayadaw to spend a couple of months each summer teaching programs at a variety of locations around the community. Between preparing for and teaching classes during the day, during the school year, and offering these special programs on Buddhist culture to hundreds of people in the evenings during summer, I never had a chance to visit my hometown or go on retreat again, learning the ABCs. As a younger person, Sayadaw never had an opportunity to learn English. By the time he became a monk, opportunities were still hard to come by. Although lay people in Burma were allowed to study English, it was different for monks in those days. Monks were prohibited from learning the language because the different temples competed with each other to see who could have the most monks pass the rigorous Pali exams. For that reason, monks were only formally allowed to learn Pali and Burmese. As a workaround to this roadblock, while a fledgling teacher, the 30-year-old Sayadaw, instructed the monks on Abhidhamma from 7-8 to 30 each evening, then he'd go outside to practice walking meditation. When he was sure no one was around, he'd slip off and secretly take a bus or taxi to learn English from a very nice layman who taught the language to 40 or 50 people each evening. The teacher happened to be from Shapa, near where Sayadaw had grown up, and although Sayadaw had to pay for transportation to get there, the teacher offered him a one-on-one education free of charge after his other students had gone home for the evening. Sayadaw would study and do homework each night, learning the ABCs and grammar, then return to Thathanaudaya Pariyatti around midnight. Only a few people knew what he was doing, as he didn't want people to know. One of those in the know was a student of his at the monastery, a young monk whom he'd told to keep quiet. Upon his return each night, Sayadaw would carefully climb the monastery fence in his robes, not easily done, and then the young monk would unlock and open the temple door for him. 60 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988, Sayadaw U Pandisa also knew what he was up to. He was supportive, telling Sayadaw, "Go and learn." The abbot didn't let on to others that he knew what Sayadaw was doing, but he supported his efforts because he did his job, teaching the monks 4 times a day. For 6 months, Sayadaw quietly snuck about learning English. By the time he finished studying under his English teacher, Sayadaw had acquired a high school level of mastery and could even write essays. Having not quite completed his degree yet, Sayadaw was also still busy juggling his university studies. In April 1977, I finished school, but still needed to pass the final examination before I could graduate. My father and the rest of my family, and even my old teacher, wanted me to come back home. I told them, if I don't pass my final examination, I will not return to Kunhat. Fortunately, Sayadaw passed the rigorous final examinations. He graduated from monastic university and received his Dhammakarya, teacher of the Dhamma degree. All that meditation I'd done those 8 summers had helped me a lot with my studies. In Burma, most of our learning was done by heart. And while it took most students at least 15 years to finish all the way through university education, it took me only 10 years. I was done. I'd earned my BA degree, which was the highest education there was in Burma at the time. We'd learned Pali, the commentaries, the sub-commentaries, and other things. So after that, I went back to my hometown for a visit. They were very happy to see me. The old monastery there had recently burned down, but a new one had been built, and I had an opportunity to visit it. Sayadaw also stopped in Mandalay to pay respect to Sayadaw U Paduma, 61 Las Vegas Sayadaw. He said, "Hey Zaya, what have you been doing in Rangoon? Did you study?" I replied, "Yes, sir. I already finished my education." "Really?" he said. He was surprised, because it had taken me only 10 years. I was still only 30 years old. There were 5 million people living in Shan State in those days. I was the very first one to complete a Dhammakarya degree. Las Vegas Sayadaw, circa May 1977, receiving his Dhammakarya degree certificate from the director of the university's Religious Studies Department. After his visit to Mandalay and Kunhat, Sayadaw returned to his life teaching in Rangoon. When I was living at Thathanaudaya Pariyati, the monks were very busy studying. And as a teacher, that kept me very busy as well. We'd wake at 4 a.m., then do morning chanting, and practice loving-kindness meditation. Then we did a bit of chanting and loving-kindness meditation again in the evening until 7 p.m. We meditated just twice a day, and not for long. 62 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. The monks spent the rest of the day studying. Later reflecting on the 17 years that he spent at Thathanaudaya Pariyati, and the nearly 23 years that he was based in Rangoon, Sayadaw would comment about how different the alms round experience had been there in the big city compared to his early novice days in Mandalay. In Rangoon, it was easy. The monks would study from 7 to 9 a.m. each day, shower, then leave for alms round at 9:30 a.m. They'd be back to the monastery by 10 a.m., then have lunch. Instead of hurrying about trying to find someone to offer alms, the monks would comfortably walk to maybe 10 homes, where they'd usually be invited inside for the offering. It had all been so easy and community-like. For the kids, it wasn't long after Sayadaw returned from his visit home that his father and 4 siblings followed him to Rangoon. Another revolt against the government had flared up in Shan State as the decades-long civil war continued to manifest in violent outbreaks. The army had recently come in again, war was ensuing, and the school serving Kunhat was closed. The situation in Shan State had been getting worse and worse in recent years. Whenever the army came around Kunhat, there was fighting. It wasn't safe for anyone. When I was there for my visit, I'd invited my whole family to live in Rangoon. Soon, they decided it was the best thing to do. That's when my dad stepped down as the leader of our village, and they came to the city. With his family now in Rangoon, Sayadaw would not have occasion, or even good reason, to return to Kunhat again. He'd reflect almost 4563 Las Vegas Sayadaw years later, that he probably knew no more than 5 people in his home village anymore, as, quote, generations have gone by since he lived there. Las Vegas Sayadaw's parents U Mayat and Da Moon. The photo of his father was taken around the mid-1970s, shortly before him and his 4 children left Kunhat to resettle in Rangoon. The photo of Sayadaw's mother was probably taken around the late 1950s. She passed away in the early 1960s. Sayadaw began to reflect on the limited educational opportunities he'd had when he lived in Kunhat, and on the educational plight of those still in the region during the continuing struggle and unrest. I thought, oh no, now the kids don't have a chance to get an education. I decided to start sponsoring some of the kids from Kunhat to go to Rangoon or other cities for education. Some of the kids were very smart, but they had poor parents, or maybe one of their parents had died. So I'd help them find a place to stay in the city, either at a temple or at a friend's family's house, so that they could go to school. Sayadaw eventually sponsored 29 children, many of them coming to Rangoon. I wanted to help as much as I could. 64 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. When their schools were closed during the weekends, all of the students would come to see me at Thathanaudaya Pariyati. They'd tell me how they needed shoes, tuition, pencils, books, or maybe they needed to go to a doctor for something. Sayadaw was happy to provide for their needs. I couldn't say no. They were far from home, so I took care of them. As a teacher, I'd go out and people would offer me a lot of donations. I saved the money for the kids, not for myself. And in the summer, before Vasa, people would offer robes. Every monk had 2 sets of robes, but those of us who were teachers might have 3 or 4 sets, because people would give us extras. So I would sell my extra robes to help fund the kids' education. I did that for many years. Sometimes the students would have problems at school or at the temples where they were staying. I'd have to go solve the problem. I had to take care of these 29 kids. I'm happy about what I've done. I wanted to do it, but I didn't have my own temple then. I let 4 or 5 kids live with me at Thathanodaya Pariyati. Then I might arrange for some of the others to stay at another temple where I knew people, maybe even in another city. Or they might stay with a family and help the family. But I'd request one thing in exchange for the kids helping the family. Let them go to school. Fortune tellers. During his years living in Rangoon, Sayadaw had begun to rekindle his childhood interest in fortune-telling. It had been a fascination of his since his grandfather exposed him to it around the time his mother had died. 65 Las Vegas Sayadaw. One day, Sayadaw called a famous fortune-teller and asked him to come to the temple to teach him. Sayadaw had always loved to acquire knowledge, but he had no interest in actually telling people their fortunes. He knew that doing so would be a violation of the Buddhist monastic code, but he saw practical value in understanding the principles behind it. People would sometimes come to the temple and relate to him what fortune tellers had told them about their horoscope. In those cases, for example, with greater knowledge of fortune-telling, he might then be more able to steer their understanding in the direction of the Buddha's teachings on karma. Sayadaw would elaborate to a young monk decades later. After all, a horoscope and karma are operating under the same principles. What matters are the choices one makes in life. We should always try to do good things. Sayadaw recalled how a woman supporter of the monastery showed up one day after an absence of 7 years. He asked the lady where she'd been. She said, "Remember how the last time I came to the temple, I offered lunch to the monks? Well, afterward, someone broke a window in my home and stole something. I came to the temple and did something good, but this happened, so I got mad at the monks and the temple." Sayadaw had taken the opportunity to remind the woman that her property being stolen didn't happen by chance. It was because of her karma from a previous life, and the people who stole her belongings created new karma for themselves. He'd suggested to the woman that if in the future someone takes her stuff, she should just consider it charity, then replace it. If we understand the law of nature, we can let it go. We don't have to worry about it. We just buy a new one. As Sayadaw was recounting this story to the young monk, the monk asked him if he'd teach him about fortune-telling. No, because it doesn't help us gain liberation. The other monks at Thathanodaya Pariyati had asked him the same. 66 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. But Sayadaw told the young monk, "It's a waste of your time. Stay away from it." He added that for an old monk or meditator, simply learning how to tell fortunes is fine. But if, for example, you're a young monk and you're asked to read the palm of a young girl, the mere fantasy of touching the girl's hands could easily lead to sexual desire. And this is a big problem. Sayadaw took the opportunity to explain to the young monk that there are different types of fortune tellers. Some can actually tell people's fortunes, some are guessing, and some are simply lying. Mostly, though, fortune tellers have a connection to spirits. Sayadaw elaborated by saying that some earthborn spirits under the name of Katu Maharajika actually live here amongst people. We sometimes call these beings tree guardians or mountain guardians. They are not qualified to reside in Katu Maharajika. Many fortune tellers pay respect to these spirits, who in turn will tell them things about people's families and private lives. None of this is the fortune teller's ability. Rather, the spirits are telling them. Sometimes, too, the The spirits will possess the fortune teller's mouth or hands. The teller will suddenly find their body moving about involuntarily. To add to the busyness of his schedule, beginning in April 1980 and continuing through 1987, Sayada was assigned to grade student examinations during the summers. Exams from across the country were sent to Rangoon, and he was amongst a group of about 10 monks who were responsible for grading them. During this time, a young Samanera of the Mon ethnic group came to live at Thathanaudaya Pariyati. The novice had ordained near his family's home at the age of 10 before eventually moving to Rangoon. The young man's name was Zautika, 67, Las Vegas Sayadaw. The future Yu Zautika trained under Sayadaw until he turned 20 years of age and took bhikkhu ordination with one of the senior monks at the temple, acting as his preceptor. He would continue training as a student under Sayadaw until 1988, when the master eventually departed for Thailand. Preceptors in Thailand, a monk authorized to ordain other monks, called a preceptor or upajjhaya, must first be appointed as such. It's not the same in Myanmar. Sayadaw explained the difference between preceptors in the two countries. According to the Vinaya, to be qualified as a preceptor, a monk must have at least 10 vasa, must know the procedure, and should be able to teach the student. So if a monk meets those criteria, in Burma he can be a preceptor. It's quite different from the way it's done in Thailand. According to Thai tradition, if you want to be a monk but there's no one available who is an authorized preceptor, you would have to travel somewhere else to find one. Or the preceptor would have to travel to you. This is their tradition, but it's not based on the Vinaya. They can't be a preceptor without first being appointed. China. Around 1986, Sayadaw was contacted by a Palong friend who'd become the abbot of a Buddhist temple in Yunnan, a southwestern province of China bordering Burma. He asked Sayadaw if he'd like to come there for a ceremony inaugurating a large Buddha statue being brought in from Mandalay. Sayadaw accepted. Yunnan state had 85 Buddhist villages. After the communists took over, though, there were no monks or nuns at all anymore. When 68 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988, the country reopened, that eventually changed. The old temples were already there, but there weren't even Buddha statues because the communist government had destroyed them. The local people wanted to have a Buddhist monk living in their midst again, so they invited my friend to be the abbot of one of the temples. The temple had no Buddha statue, so the monk bought a big 6-foot-tall statue from Mandalay and made arrangements for its delivery. My friend planned to have a big ceremony for the occasion, so he invited me to come. He had only been in robes for a few years and didn't know much about Buddhism yet, so he asked me to support him in offering the Dhamma to temple-goers. As Sayadaw prepared to leave Burma and travel to Yunnan state, the situation was bad in both countries. Burma had communists too. They were fighting with the government. Just before I left, the government officials told me, "We can't take responsibility for you. If you go, it's at your own risk." Meanwhile, a date had been set for the big ceremony in Yunnan. Lots of people were expecting me and the people I was traveling with to arrive with the new Buddha statue that my friend asked us to bring from Burma. There were no cell phones in those days, so I had no way to tell my friend in Yunnan state about the government officials' concerns about the safety of the journey. Sayadaw decided to take a chance and go for it. Although it was a very dangerous situation, me and 2 other monks rented a car, which we shared with 3 women, and made the journey overland from Rangoon to Mandalay, then on to Yunnan state. We eventually crossed the Burmese border with the large Buddha statue and entered China. 69. Las Vegas Sayadaw. When we arrived safely in Yunnan state, hundreds of people were excitedly awaiting our arrival. As we passed through each village on the way to the temple, we were greeted with warmth and enthusiasm. We finally arrived at the temple around 1 a.m. Sayadaw stayed in Yunnan state for a few months, traveling around a bit locally. Every day, though, hundreds of people came to the temple to hear me give the Dhamma, which I offered in the Shan language. The local people said they could understand about 75% of what I taught them, as the Shan language was similar to their own language. Within a few years, the Burmese government conquered the communist regime in their country. 1989 was the last year of communism in Burma. A visitor from Thailand, in early 1987, Sayadaw received a letter from a monk in Thailand. There was a very special, very famous monk in Thailand, the most famous monk in the country at the time, and he was only 30 years old. His name was Ajahn Nikorn. He was from Chiang Mai. He had millions of followers and 33 branch monasteries in Thailand. I don't know how he got my address. He later said he couldn't remember who gave it to him. But he and his friend asked me to lead them and some of their followers on a pilgrimage in Burma. I can speak Shan, of course, which is somewhat similar to the Thai language. Between that, hand gestures, and a bit of English, which they didn't really speak, we got by. I took them to Mandalay and Bagan, everywhere in Burma, twice. For the first 2-week pilgrimage, there were 40 people. The second 2-week pilgrimage, which I took them on a year later, had 8470 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988 people, 40 monks, and 44 lay people. I was still teaching during that time but took time off to do these pilgrimages. This would prove to be the beginning of the end of Sayadaw's time living in Burma. On the practice of jhana, while instructing a student on the Arupa jhanas, Sayadaw was asked if someone who attains one of these formless jhanas is close to being an arahant. No, because it's tranquility meditation. He elaborated by telling a story from the time of the Buddha. He had 2 teachers, Alara Kalama, who gained the 3rd formless jhana, and Udaka Ramaputta, who gained the 4th formless jhana. The Buddha went to them and learned from them both, but after a few days he reached the same levels of jhana. He then asked his teachers if there was more to their practice. They told him, no, that's it. The Buddha recognized that theirs was not the way to liberation, so he left and practiced on his own in the jungle for 6 years. After the Buddha gained supreme enlightenment, he pondered who could understand his teaching. He remembered both of his teachers but then learned that Ulara had passed away just a week earlier and had been reborn in the formless sphere, Arupaloka. He also learned that Udaka had just died the night before. What a great loss for them, the Buddha thought. If only they could listen to my Dhamma, they could gain enlightenment. But since both teachers had been reborn in the Arupa plane, the Buddha couldn't teach them because they no longer had a body. 71 Las Vegas, Sayadaw added that the new lifespan of the Buddha's 2 teachers is very long, as much as 84,000 Mahakapa. It would be an extremely long time before they could be reborn in a celestial world, or the human world, and therefore capable of hearing the Dhamma. And even then they could do bad karma and be reborn in a plane of misery. As such, the Buddha didn't recommend one rely on tranquility meditation only to help them. Sayadaw continued his reply to the student with some discussion on Jainism. Jainism is one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions. Although their tradition holds that the religion was established millions of years ago, its most current leader was Mahavira, circa 599 BCE to circa 527 BCE, who was an elder contemporary of the Buddha. Although the 2 Indian masters knew of each other, they are not believed to have met. The Jains practice samatha meditation and can sit for days by the power of their jhana. But they can't gain enlightenment. That is, their method of practice will not take them to the end of suffering. They've practiced like this since before the Buddha was born. The Buddha taught that the Jain path wasn't the right way, as it was not the Noble Eightfold Path. They have sila and samadhi, but they don't understand mind and matter as arising and disappearing. The Buddha taught anicca, suffering, and non-self, or anatta. But the Jains believe in self, atta, and it's because of this that they can't gain enlightenment. Sayadaw explained that the Jains can acquire incredible willpower because of their concentration and jhana. They torture themselves, especially with respect to sexual desire. They torture their bodies. Even though it's the mind that wants, they hurt the body first. 72 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988. He recalled one of his 4 visits to India when he paid a visit to a large Jain temple. Although he didn't see any of their monks around, He acknowledged that the supporters respect the Jain ascetics a lot, as they believe them to be content and practicing hard. But the Buddha said their practice is not correct. Sayadaw also spoke of a group of Jains who went to practice at a Bombay meditation center in the tradition of the famous Burmese-born lay Vipassana meditation teacher S.N. Goenka. The Jains soon returned to their temple and continued to follow their own tradition. They're attached to their tradition. But this has gone on for centuries. You can't easily convince them to change their beliefs, so we, as Buddhists, are lucky. As a further elaboration of his point, Sayadaw talked about the ancient Hindu belief that all of one's sins will disappear if one bathes in the Ganga River. Also known as the Ganges, this 1,569-mile-long Indian river is the most sacred river of Indian Hindus. Is this possible? He asked rhetorically. No, it is not. The Buddha said if it was possible, then all the fish and other living creatures living in the river would have no sin at all. Sayadaw told the student about another one of the trips he'd made to India. At 4 a.m. one day, I went to the Ganga to watch the people trying to purify their minds in the river. The Buddha said this is not the right way. And I don't recommend practicing jhana. The student asked, then why did the Buddha tell his disciples to practice it? Sayadaw explained that it was a good practice in the time of the Buddha. But it wasn't enough. After gaining jhana, meditators have to continue practicing vipassana in order to attain enlightenment. And in those days it was very easy for meditators to gain jhana, because they didn't live in cities or even villages. They lived in the forest, where it was quiet and free from distractions. 73, Las Vegas, Sayadaw. But nowadays you're confronted with good and bad things, which give rise to lobha and dosa. In the forest, there was nothing. So it was very easy to gain concentration and jhana. A meditator would then practice vipassana and gain enlightenment. But doing this is very hard these days, given all the distractions around us. Sayadaw explained to the student that if you gain enlightenment, you'll never lose it, not even in the next life. But you can lose jhana anytime. A meditator needs to practice for years to gain jhana, but can lose it in just 1 second. And it can take a long time to get it back, particularly if one is upset about losing it. The master then shared an old short story about a novice monk who'd practiced meditation, gained the 5th jhana, and acquired supernormal knowledge. He could fly. The novice was flying around one day when he heard a group of teenage girls singing. When attachment to the beauty of their song arose in him, he dropped to the earth. After he got up and dusted himself off, he talked to one of the singers and then decided to leave the monastic life. He eventually went on to marry the girl. The student commented to Sayadaw about a book he'd read, in which it said how someone who practices vipassana can take a break and switch to samatha meditation. Sayadaw Abhadabhai explained that this can be done, as samatha is a useful practice. However, once one's practice has progressed to the point of gaining the higher insight knowledges, to practice samatha meditation would be a bit like reviewing your old high school textbooks after finishing your BA degree. Sayadaw continued by saying that if someone gains jhana, it's because they practiced a lot of samatha meditation in a previous life. But if you 74 Rangoon, 1967 to 1988, weren't interested in samatha meditation in a previous life, you can't gain jhana in this life. And then there are those meditators who gain both jhana and magga in a previous life. It all depends on the parami we've accumulated. Our ultimate goal, vipassana, takes us there directly. But samatha takes a meandering route. It's indirect and takes a long time. So do you want to go directly or indirectly? Time is too short. Life is too short. Go directly. If you don't reach it before you die, no worries. Just continue in your next life. You're already 75% there. This is why one person may gain enlightenment easily, but others have to work very hard. It depends on our paramai. 75.